Again, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mariah O'Mara. I will be the host for today, and I am the head of media here at HundrED. So we have a really packed schedule for everyone today. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping points. This session is being recorded and it will be provided at the end. So you will get the recording. We will do Q&A throughout. So our head of community, Pukraj, will be responsible for taking questions. Thank you for the wave. And so please use the Q&A box on the chat. It's at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to answer questions. We have designated spots for that throughout the session. And then we do ask at the end, we will have a survey for you. And we ask that you please fill that out for us. It will be very helpful going forward and moving on to our next webinar. So moving on, I want to do a quick promotion for our HundrED Ambassadors program. If you are not familiar with the HundrED Ambassadors program, which is some of you are, seems like a lot of you, this is your first webinar. Well, our HundrED Ambassadors program, we have over 400 students, teachers, parents, school leaders from all over the world who have joined this ambassadors program, and it is an excellent resource for learning about new educational initiatives. So I encourage you to consider becoming an ambassador. We will drop a link for that as well. Next, moving on to the schedule for today. So just, I will finish talking and very soon, and then we will go ahead and open up the discussions. Again, we have 3 sessions for Q&A. The last Q&A session, we will actually open it up to you. We would like to hear from the community. So I will contact you. You will come onto the screen and you can ask Pasi and Saku your questions yourself. And that brings me to our next point, which is my honor to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Pasi Sahlberg, who is a professor of education policy at the Glonsky Institute at the University of in Sydney, Australia. He is a renowned author, professor, and educator, as well as our own Saku Tuominen, who is our founder and creative director here at HundrED. He is an entrepreneur, innovator, author, keynote speaker, and also an olive oil producer. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Saku. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
And here we go. Thank you, Mariah, for the opening words, and thank you all joining us today in this 60-minute session about leadership under crisis. What is the goal of this session? When in HundrED, when we've been studying successful, great schools, I think that there's one thing that is uniting all of those, which is a great leadership. And I think that when we've been trying to identify the situations in all continents and various countries, cities, schools during the COVID-19, I think that if and when countries have been coping quite well, it all goes back to great leadership. And whenever there's been massive challenges, I think that in quite often there are some challenges in the leadership area. So when we are talking about this this session today, we want to be discussing about how could a high quality leadership look like in a crisis like this. And we are talking about leadership in country level, we are talking about leadership in city level, school level, and even on a class level. So we are discussing about all of these during the following 60 minutes. How does the process work? Lasse, if we could get the next slide, please. Me and Pasi, we've been discussing about this quite a lot during the past four weeks. And then we have created a 10-step plan, which you are more than happy to challenge as well. And that's actually one of the goals of this session. So we think is that first of all, a strong leadership is needed. Then there has to be a clarity of communication. In order to be able to have that one, vision is needed. and you have to engage the community. You have to be looking for solutions. You have to test them. You have to select the best ones, but that's not enough. You have to continue to develop them. You have to be able to provide reasonable resources, and you have to understand that it's not going to be simple. And today we are going to be discussing about, in the first session, we are going to be discussing about the points 1 to 4, then having a short Q&A, and then 5 to 7. And what is the end result of all of this? This is and Lasse, so what is the end result of all of this? Is that today we are having a first webinar, and then we are going to have a second one on the following Monday. And we are going to be discussing with HundrED community throughout. Then we are going to be constructing a survey regarding the key findings. We are asking feedback from you on the 10 steps. We are doing case studies, we are doing interviews, and our goal is that after all of this, we are going to be releasing a leadership toolkit for all the education leaders all over the world. And the goal of that one is to help each and everyone to lead during a situation like this. So that's the ambitious goal of this one, and today is the starting point of this process. With these words, I'm happy to go now to Australia. In Finland, it's snowing. In Australia, it's plus 20 degrees, even though it's late night. So Pasi, how is life in Australia? Can you unmute?
Yes, Saku. Yes, hello everybody, and good night from good evening actually from Sydney, Australia. Life is good. Life is probably very similar to what it is in Finland in terms of the COVID-19 circumstances. But it's been a good day, and people are looking at things probably a little bit more positive way than they did a couple of weeks ago.
And short update regarding the schools in Australia. What is happening with the lockdown?
Yeah, Australia has a different school systems depending on which state or territory you are in. Here in New South Wales, where I am, this is the week now when the children are beginning to gradually return to school. We have 2 school-age children at home here, and they will have the next couple of weeks 1 day a week. So they go to school only 1 day a week, and then hoping that things will start to return back to more normal situation. But gradually, like this week, last week and this week are the times when children are returning back to school.
Okay, great. But let's start the discussion about the 10 steps, and let's start with the points 1 and 2, which are leadership and communication. And let's start with the leadership. Whenever you are discussing about extreme situations like this, all the crises, a strong leadership is needed. Someone to show the direction, someone to help people to cope with these. At the same time, education has not been the simplest one on this area because there's a lot of autonomy in various countries and so on. So how do you see the role of leadership in education? How should it look like?
Yes, Saku, I think that this is a very logical order of these issues that you have put together to start with this. Before I say anything else, and I try to be very brief with these things so that we can really have a conversation about those things, I would like to recognize the work that HundrED is doing, because it's exactly networks like this. We now probably have 100, 200 people, something like this, joining us in this webinar, and hundreds or maybe thousands of more will be joining the conversation later. And I think it's very important to realize, all of you there, that the Saku nor I, we don't have the solutions to these issues. We are just, our job here is to try to spark the conversation and really emphasize the fact as well that in these networks like HundrED, and there are many others, but HundrED is a good example, the good solutions to most of these issues that we are talking about here, and many of those problems that people joining this webinar are dealing with, the solutions are somewhere there in the network. And that's really the kind of a key point here, that we we invite you to join this process, just like Saku was explaining what's going to happen next. That don't listen to us as somebody who will be able to tell you exactly what to do and give you the right answers. We are basically inviting you to join the conversation. The other thing I want to say before we get into this conversation is that you saw in a earlier slide that why we are having these webinars, and it's to try to provide quality education for everybody. And we what we do know, both Saku and I and most of you, that it's no magic to provide quality education to some children, and that's exactly what is happening now. But it's quite a different thing to take seriously this commitment that the HundrED has to provide quality education for each and every child, and that's what we are talking about here. It's very important to keep this in mind. But getting back to this leadership thing, Saku, you're absolutely right that education, whether it's a system or school, is a very peculiar field to lead. It's not like you have experience in leading business organizations and others, but education is often, although people say that you can run education system or school as a business, but it's a very different thing. There are so many different diverse stakeholders there with wildly different expectations that makes this thing hard. Just take the example of school where you have 300 or 500 children. You have up to 1,000 parents there, and the whole community of grandparents and everybody there, and they all may have a very different view about what they're expecting you to do as a school. So for somebody who is leading the school or somebody who is leading the school system, this is extremely complicated challenge. So that's why I think that we need to really be humble in front of before this the question of how to lead education, whether it's a school or education system. And I guess that something that I've seen leaders do, whether it's a minister who is leading the whole system, or somebody who's leading the district or cluster of schools, or somebody who's a school leader, is that whenever people truly give a voice to those who are at the heart of the education process, and certainly teachers and children, not just parents and the community, but teachers and children, they often are able to come up with a very different idea of leadership. And if you compare this to a business organization, and I would like to ask you, Saku, to speak about your views on that. There are very few businesses where the children, very young kids often would be the key stakeholders, like in education. And so if we want to engage, normally in the businesses, you engage clients, those who hold the shares or own the business or are the key consumers of what the businesses are doing. They have a different role to play. But in the crisis situations, especially something like we are living in it now, education systems and subsystems or districts and schools that have already created clear principles and ideas of what leadership is in a school. What does it mean to have a shared or collaborative leadership, like many schools in Finland today has, and some schools here in Australia, of course. They are often much more flexible and better prepared to not only react to the crisis, but also proactively change the course of the crisis. But that we can talk about those issues that are required a little bit later. But I think that your point here, and this is an invitation again to everybody who has joined us in this webinar to think about how different and how difficult educational leadership actually is, if you want to do it in a good way.
If we are moving forward to points maybe 2, even 3 and 4, I think that a lot of great leadership goes back to clarity of communication and consistency of communication. I think all the great leaders, they are able to simplify the message and yet keep it empowering as well. And the best leaders in these times, I think that they have been able to provide a consistent communication towards the community taking care of all the possible target groups. And in education, it's actually quite complicated, because you should be communicating to teachers, you should be communicating to kids, and you should be communicating to parents, and explain them quite openly, is that where we are at the moment, where is it that we can realistically think that we can be during this time, and what are the main challenges, and how to cope with those. And you cannot provide a fully functioning bulletproof ABC of this one, but you should be you should be able to provide a vision that people buy and people are excited about. And I think that it doesn't happen without engaging the whole of the community. So when we were discussing with Pasi, we thought that the first 4 points are leadership, consistent communication, creating a common vision, which doesn't happen without active listening, and then engaging people by inviting them to participate. So how do you see, Pasi, the role of communication in times like this?
Yeah, Lasse, can I get my screen back, because I have some notes there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think these are really connected issues that you, as you mentioned, Saku. And again, let me say once again that these first 4 points are really something that I'm sure that the 100 people would love to hear your experiences as well. For example, the communication. I've been following and watching how different systems are going through and coping with this crisis now. Here in Australia, different parts and the states are having a little bit different strategies, and then there's a kind of a federal system being part of the communication as well, and also in Finland and the United States and Scotland and some other countries. And the common thing for all of those, and New Zealand as well, if there's anybody from New Zealand joining us, and all of these systems, just like you said, Saku, that the main challenge is how to communicate these crisis issues that are very complex and complicated and very rapidly changing and evolving in a ways that everybody would understand, especially when you have a different kind of a layers of management or leadership, as many schools in the world are. They are not directly led or managed by one entity. That they may have a district, and there may be a school board, and there may be a kind of a state level system, and then a federal system. And often, like here in Australia, for example, the big issue has been the kind of a mixed messages that people at the level of the school and community has received about what to do and when to return back to school, what to do when the kids are not over there. And I think that this, the interesting thing in this situation is really to try to focus on this communication, how different systems and different people communicate about these things. And there are big differences how these things are explained to the parents and teachers and many others. So I think that those education systems that have been able to have a communication plan ready or design that early on in this crisis, they are doing much better than those who have been kind of trying to deny that everything's going to be fine and next week this is all over, and then get back to the business of planning the communication only when it's absolutely kind of a must. They have had more hard time to do that. I think the communication is not only and the communication plan here that we are talking about is not only to communicate what has happened, and that's the important thing. I think the good communication here also includes conversations about what is about to happen in the future, although it's a very hard to say that, but that's what people want to hear. And that's for example here in Australia, New South Wales, many teachers and schools have said that we just want to know what is what are the next ideas and next thoughts. And if that is not part of the communication, then I think in education the situation is going to be very confusing, as it has been in many places.
All right, so lots of really good questions. It's quite hard to pick few, but if you haven't seen, you can always upvote other community questions. So we'll start with a question/comment that Justin Blake has made. So Pasi and Saku, this is for you guys. The 10 steps completely resonate, and I fully support this. In addition to working in partnership with OECD going forward, what are your thoughts and practical suggestions on how we engage the influential stakeholders who are education ministers and those writing and shaping policy, shaping the future of education in nations and globally together? Those are at the heart of shaping policy and national education system. So as we talked about leadership and the need for a common vision, what role do you think education ministers and influential stakeholders play?
I think we lost Saku for a moment. Is there? Oh. No, I think that this is, if I start while we wait for Saku to join, I think starting from the kind of a highest level of the global international level, it's been interesting to see how actively all major international organizations, OECD, the World Bank, UN organizations, World Economic Forum, you name it, have been actively taking part in this, this education part of the campaign, global campaign to try to go through this very difficult time. So it's a good sign that it's not only kind of an economic or political conversation, but it's really focusing also in education. So that's the good thing. I've been fortunate to have access to work with couple of education ministers at the moment while they do this, and I must say that I have a lot of sympathy for the complexity of their work that they're going through, and I understand that many education ministers today are too busy with their national practical questions like reopening the schools and communicating to parents what is going to happen, that it may be hard for people like me or you to really reach out to them and try to engage them in a further conversations and communication about those things. So I would on behalf of these very busy political system leaders, I would ask people's understanding and tolerance if the ministers are not responding to your emails or Twitter messages, because there are so many other things that they are doing. But I think that there are many positive signs that are speaking in favor of a kind of a more collective, collaborative approach to try to find ways and solutions through the crisis. I think that most organizations and most system leaders and school leaders as well are probably thinking about already about the recovery more than they are thinking about how to survive and cope and deal with these complex issues. And that's going to be an interesting thing when we move to actively to the recovery period and phase. That what are we talking about then, and what is the role of these leaders? That I have no idea, but as I said, I think that there are good things in the air, but there are also open things regarding this collaboration and engagement. But good question, great question actually.
And maybe I can kind of go a little deeper, and Saku, you can join in as well. So you talked about the recovery phase, which will sooner than later is going to impact the education stakeholder community. So we have a question from Gregorius Kuku Nugroho, who asks, what do you suggest for the educational leadership preparation in the world? So the way school principals and school leaders are prepared, or even the people who are responsible for multiple schools, what should be the way they must be prepared if a crisis like this happens again? And Saku, maybe you can also jump in on this question.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why we decided to create a list like checklist manifesto like this with Pasi, so that anybody could be checking is that do we know who's going to be leading this? Do we have a communication strategy? Are we able to engage people? Can we know what solutions to use? Do we have sufficient resources that are kind of like making certain that each and every family, even the ones who are in difficult position, they have the resources to do and so on. So this is one of the reasons we decided to make this happen. Pasi, do you want to comment this one?
Yeah, just one thing is, Ken, a great question. I would just propose one thing that will definitely be helpful if something like this or similar unexpected crisis situation happens, and it may actually happen sooner than we think within the same health issue. I think for education leaders now and tomorrow, certainly, they need to be kind of literate in terms of the global education issues. And that is something that not all the education leaders and not all the countries take it seriously like this. But I think, again, the HundrED is a good example of the power of having access to global thought leaders and thinkers and practitioners and innovators. And unless you have this global education literacy, it's it's almost like a language that if you don't know how to communicate what's going on, it's hard to be part of the conversation. But I think that all of those education leaders today who have their own networks or have networks like this or any other are much better prepared, both mentally and also professionally, to cope and deal with and communicate the issues that they are facing in their leadership. So gain global educational literacy about the things that are happening around the world and where are the people worth talking to and asking opinion.
One more question to Pasi before moving to the solutions, innovations, and selecting and implementing them. I think that because education community is such a diverse one, it's not a simple task to keep the consistency of communication. And I'll give you an example from Finland. It was really interesting because people, the teachers, the students, the parents, they need some kind of clarity on how should we cope. And in Finland, what happened is that the Minister of Education gave a speech, and she said that in these difficult times, you shouldn't be following curriculum too much. You should be giving more freedom, you should be more flexible, and so on. And interestingly, in some of the cities, the message was almost totally opposite. And it's easy to understand that some of the teachers and some of the parents are confused, asking that, yeah, who should be listened to? So how do you kind of like keep this clear enough?
Absolutely. And I think, Saku, mixing both your and Pasi's point about global digital literacy and then community being essential for us to cope with future crises, maybe we could jump to the next points and continue this Q&A after that. So
that's fine. Fine. So the points 5 to 7 are sort of like the next stage of this leadership plan. So once you have decided is that, okay, this is the direction where we want to be heading and people, all the target groups, parents, students, teachers are somehow on board, then the points 5 to 7 are is that then you should start to look for impactful solutions that are quite easy to implement. And even though there's a urgency, you should be testing them and have a feeling is that, okay, these are the ones that are well received by teachers or students or parents, and then select the ones and provide sufficient resources to implement them well. And when we've been going through the discussion in all continents, I think that there's actually not a lack of tools or solutions or toolkits or resources. I'd say even contrary. And when discussing with many of the teachers, they have a feeling that there's almost too much noise, there's almost too many solutions. And people would say that, no, give us the ones that work and help us to simplify the situation. So what is your take on this one, Pasi?
Yeah, I think this is the interesting part of the conversation. And again, this is something where we need people people's ideas there. I think, again, if we focus on the current crisis and probably future similar situations where people don't exactly know what is going to happen next or what to do next, the learning, now I'm talking about the systems like schools or school systems or national education systems, that learning from one another becomes a hard currency in a crisis like this, particularly when nobody really knows what's going to happen next. So those organizations and systems that are good at learning from one another, and there are big differences in at least in the system level when it comes to ability to really learn and understand what's going on. Those that have developed the advanced abilities to learn from one another, again, it can be a school or it can be a school system, they are probably able to navigate much less harm and difficulties through these difficult times. I think Finland is often used as an example of a system that has been fairly good learner during the past 30 or 40 years from other systems. But then there are a number of education systems and probably more schools that do not have this ability to really understand the difference between borrowing ideas and learning policies and learning ideas. And I think the critical thing here when we are looking for the solutions is really to learn from others what they do rather than adopt innovations or ideas without learning them. And finally, I think that the language here is a really important thing. We speak now English here, and for many of us, probably most of us, English is not the first language, but we still communicate in English. And what people mostly do is that they also communicate about the education innovation in English. So we miss a lot of good ideas that are developed and used in other languages, and nobody should think that if there are no good ideas found in English, there might be still good ideas available and practiced and used, and solutions that are somewhere hidden behind the different languages. So that's the other one that I always encourage education leaders and school leaders also to move beyond this natural barrier of communicating in a global language like English, and go and check what the people in Portugal do, or Swahili, or some of the original languages here in Australia, how people think about these same problems and solutions over there. So that's, looking for these solutions is extremely important to truly exercise this global understanding of issues.
I think that education is interesting area in many respects. I know quite a few of CEOs of listed companies, and I know what happened with them once the crisis started. They had a couple of Zoom discussions between the CEOs, and they were extremely eager to learn from each other. They were saying that, how do you communicate with your personnel? How often should you communicate? What tools should you be using? And so on and so on. And they were really excited about learning from each other, even across borders. But when, for example, in HundrED, when we've been trying to study the learning, for example, between governments, so that what Finland is learning from Australia, or what Sweden is learning from France or Portugal and so on, that kind of dialogue is not really happening, where we would be kind of like extremely open and curious about the great innovations happening globally. So what is your take on the curiosity and the willingness to learn within the education ecosystem?
No, I think there's certainly a huge amount of interest in ideas and innovation in different parts of the world. I think everybody's looking for good ideas, particularly in this situation when we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But I'm not so sure about that people everywhere would understand the difference between taking an idea or purchasing an idea. They're often on sale, that you buy an idea or innovation somewhere, or learning something from somebody else, and those are two different things. And
Totally.
and sometimes, you know, you can find an innovation or idea somewhere in another culture or other system and bring it home and try to do it in your own school or school system, and then you wonder why it doesn't work. It was so nice in this original place, but it doesn't work here. But you know, learning these innovations is it's a much more complicated thing, because you need to learn about, you know, where this idea was developed and why did it work in that environment and that that culture, and how the culture in the school or the society that surrounds the school back home and in that original place, how they are similar and different. And this is exactly, it's like learning any other issues. And that's why, Saku, I think that there's a huge appetite and hunger now for almost any types of ideas that are available. Often people go with this low-hanging fruit and they just take the first thing that they see, rather than going a harder way and really try to learn and understand what's going on. I think, you know, this is one of those things we have been speaking about when we talk about the Finnish model of education, and the fact that Finland has been 20 years now as an interesting spotlight for others. Is that, do you really understand what Finland is doing? Can you really distinguish these features and characteristics that would determine why some of these things that Finnish schools and teachers do work there, and why they probably don't work in your own school or your own system? And most people don't have time to do those things. They just go with the kind of a first idea. And so that's why I think, you know, I would really put the accent on between this adopting an idea or innovation and learning it from somebody else. You can design and create your own ideas, but it's learning is a critically important thing.
I fully agree. One brief question before handing it over to Pukraj. How do you see the balance between, because everyone is having a sense of urgency, meaning this is happening, we need to identify solutions and we need to start implementing immediately, and at the same time we should know whether they are well received, whether they work, whether they are easy to use, and so on. So how do you see the balance, delicate balance between having kind of like urgency and having patience, knowing what works and not being too slow?
It's a good question, Saku, and this probably goes back to the conversations we had years ago when you first came up with this idea of HundrED, and we spoke about innovations. I think it's very important, particularly this time, for those who are you know, thinking about this innovation and whether things work or whether they are good for the system or the school, to distinguish basically two different types of innovations. There are those that we are inventing right now, that people are kind of creating these ideas and working, doing research, and then you know, having a new idea how to do something in a new way that improves things. But in education, and I spoke about that in HundrED Summit a couple of years ago, there's a huge amount of innovation in education created during the last 100 years, really, but probably more importantly during the last 30 years, that have never been used, that have been created and tested and researched, and then the time wasn't right, or people were just not able to capture or understand what's going on. And these innovations, these ideas, they're actually in a kind of a storehouse somewhere, or warehouse of educational innovations. And that's it's like a mega size IKEA store full of unused educational innovations ready to be used right now at this time. I'm not saying that all of them are kind of useful and helpful, but there are a lot of things. What I'm trying to say here is that, you know, this urgency that you spoke about often will block us, because we don't have a patience and urgency to kind of a time to you know, test and really understand whether these new ideas are doing any good. But then if we look backwards, you know, if we look backwards in history and ask that, has anybody ever done anything like this before? I'm quite sure that almost everything in education has been done by somebody. And I'm almost sure that almost any question that we have, or how to do something, or what to do in this situation, can be found somewhere that somebody in the past had created something, but it was not used that way. And that's why I'm saying that, anybody who is in the business of education innovations, continue working on the new ideas that are developed for the time and this situation, but never think that nothing has been happening or done in the past, because there are a lot of good and great things over there.
Exactly.
So that may be one thing for those who feel that we don't have time to do all these things. Look back, check what is there.
Agree, yeah. And to sum it up from my behalf is that how we see the situation is that part of the vision has to be is that this has to be providing quality education for all, even the ones who are lacking connection and so on. And then the possible solutions should take this into the consideration, because otherwise we are just widening the gap. But books, let's have a few questions from the community, and then we are handing it over to Mariah, and then we are having people asking by the video. But books, let's have like 1 or 2 questions from you, and then to Mariah.
Absolutely. And I love how positive both of you were in terms of, bringing that kind of narrative into the education discussion, that innovations have always been happening. There's this lack of potentially just sharing and communicating it in the right way. And maybe sometimes the timing isn't right, but I do think the current COVID climate really brings us this opportunity to innovate and celebrate amazing new pedagogies. But while we have that discussion, Rati Adiputri has asked a very important question that has been upvoted by a lot of people on our on this discussion, is regarding the lack of technological access. So be it internet, TV, computer, radio, there are many cases in middle income, low income countries where there's a huge digital poverty. So in those situations, what would you suggest? Like, how do we move forward from there?
If I can comment briefly, is that question is spot on. And when we are promoting innovations, we are not promoting technical innovations, but we are also promoting innovations which can work in these extreme situations. So I think that the key thing in here would be is that you have a vision, meaning is that we have to be able to provide high quality education even in these situations. And then we should be really good at identifying the possible solutions so that we are so much more prepared on the next time when something like this happens. Or what do you think yourself, Pasi?
Yeah, I think the same way. And I also, I believe that if something like this in the same scale, that we have 1.5 billion children learning at home when the classes are cancelled would happen again, that one thing that we learn here in Australia and many other places is that we probably wouldn't assume that online learning through technology and all these platforms would be the best way to move forward. That definitely is something that will help and support. But for example, here in this country, there was a study released last week that concluded that more than half of the Australian children are actually not benefiting, actually suffering from this online distance learning situation, and mostly because of the lack of access and technology that they do. We also know that what this coronavirus pandemic has revealed around the world until now are the huge inequalities overall in our education systems. Here in Australia, we say that the COVID-19 has probably not been able to create or is not behind any new inequalities, but it has really casted a gasoline into the old existing inequalities. That is actually a good news, because people are much more aware and they see firsthand in the families what it means to, for example, have issues with the access to the fairly good educational stuff that the schools have been provided to the schools. But I think that what is happening after this, hopefully, is that we, as education systems and educators, think much harder about, what the learning should look like if the children are not able to come to school. And now, unfortunately, I think in many places, as I have seen, that is that the thinking is that we try to do online learning using technology and all those things that we have available almost identically as if the teachers were there. And that's not that's a lesson that we will take from the next one. And to this wonderful HundrED network, if if there are anybody there listening to this conversation, if you have ideas and thoughts about what this kind of a next kind of a second reaction to this type of crisis should look like. What do we do with the online learning and these digital tools that must be used, but not necessarily in the same way? Let us know, because that's an important lesson.
You can clearly see that technology can solve all the issues. I do think that Mariah has some of our community members already ready to ask questions. Mariah, shall I pass it on to you?
So Penny, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, is that good? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So thank you, everyone. What a fascinating seminar. So I posted a few questions, but I maybe I'll fuse them together. But I started with that notion of what especially based on what you just said just now, what are the spaces opening up to do schools differently and to reimagine education? While this crisis is devastating and tragic, I think this is timely in that we can do things differently. We're a creative community and we can act together in some kind of movement. And obviously, HundrED is leading the way on this. And I suppose it links to my second question, which was around how we prioritise creativity and critical thinking at this time. And especially, I'm an artist and an educator, but how can the arts and culture inform a more creative and compassionate education system? So, big questions, small time.
No, I really appreciate your notion, Penny, that we are a creative community, and I also do hope that now when we are slowly entering into this recovery conversation, that will be probably more interesting than the survival that we have been going through now, that we focus much more on the issues that you mentioned, the arts and music and physical education, and certainly play as part of the serious education that we should be considering. I think the unfortunate thing is that if the conversation when we are moving to the recovery phase would include questions like how do we catch up, how do we kind of make sure that we will not lose the 3 or 4 or 5 months of learning time when the kids are in the school, that's really not a creative conversation. I think we should be asking exactly these questions, that what are the roles of those subjects that are often been considered as a secondary or tertiary in the schools, namely arts and drama and music and other things. And finally, I think that the most of the children, at least here in Australia, many of the children would need exactly that. They don't need a kind of a harder and longer study of the old content and style that was there before this crisis. I think what they need now, many children need time to establish, rebuild the social connections and relationships that they had in the school. And there's no better way to do that than build that around play and arts and music and other things. I'm a math teacher by profession, so I wouldn't dare to say anything bad about mathematics, but I think there are many other important things, particularly now when we are trying to help especially all the young people to get back to the more normal life. But great question, Penny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny. And was having a problem getting connection with one of our other participants, but I think a question that's been going on throughout, and maybe if you could just expand on this a little bit. I know we've discussed it, but with schools being shut down, there's been a huge debate about how to get proper quality education into remote areas without internet. And I think our own connection issues today show just how difficult and important that question is. So I was wondering if you could give some suggestions for how to keep students engaged during this time.
Maria, are you asking me or somebody else?
I'm asking you. It looks like we have lost Saku.
Saku, yeah, okay. Well, the brief answer is that I don't know. I have no idea what to do. That's something that I was just listening the one presentation here in Sydney that said that in this country we have 2.5 million people that are not digitally inclusive, meaning that they don't have access to the internet or skills to even use the computers or technology if it's there. And this is Australia. It's huge, and many of these families are the ones where they are children going to school, and there's nothing that, we cannot teach people these things even if we give them iPads or computers in a week. So there has to be, again, going back to Penny's earlier thing, we are a creative community, and if the situation is that technology is the obstacle for doing, keeping things going, then we have to go around somehow with that. But other than that, these are all these lessons that we need to learn carefully and consider what to do. And again, I hope that nobody would hear these thoughts as being kind of a critical to technology. Quite the opposite. I think it's a wonderful way to do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. But just building everything on the one size fit all type of solution will not do any good. So let's take one of these questions, to talk about in the future, that what in the network, what did you do when something like this happened?
Thank you so much for that segue, Pasi. And I would like to ask everyone who's here, we've heard a lot of great questions, a lot of great suggestions. And I think what Pasi said about, we just don't know, but there's so many people on the ground doing so many amazing things. So we really would love to hear from you. After this webinar, we are going to be sending out a survey. It should take no more than 15 minutes. It's just, again, to go forward and for next steps. We would like to see what has been working, what your country, what your school, what your city, what you have been doing during this time, because it's been such an unprecedented situation. We need to learn from all of the activities that people are doing on the ground. And we would also ask that if anybody is willing to participate, we are going to be doing interviews, and we would like to interview the community and see, again, what has been working, what hasn't been working. So please do take the time, no more than 15 minutes, to fill out that survey. Moving on, we are going to have a second part of this webinar. Hopefully the internet connection will be better, but it will be at the same time next Monday. So same time, same place. Pukuraj is going to drop the link for the Zoom webinar into the chat, so you can go ahead and sign up for that. And if your question did not get answered, or if you still have other questions, we encourage you to please join us again next week. We will be here and we will discuss the final 3 points, but we will also go on and we will talk about some next steps, which I think Saku will jump in and give the agenda for our next session.
Yeah, I mean, once more, my apologies for the connection. Hopefully it will work next week better. But what we will be discussing with Pasi next week is that, first of all, we will be going back. We will be checking the feedback, the questions you have been able to provide during this session, and we will try to answer many of those. But also, if we go back to the points 8 to 10, there's I'd say one of the most crucial areas which we slightly touched today is after we have the vision, after we have the solutions, and so on. The question is, how do we keep developing them? How do we keep learning what works, what doesn't work? How do we make certain that there's enough resources that they can be implemented even in difficult areas and so forth? So Pasi, how do you see this role of, once we have the solutions, how do you see the role of implementation at scale and developing and co-developing them, learning from what works and what doesn't work? So this whole massive area which we will be discussing about next week.
Yeah, that is the key question, really. The answer depends on on the solution, what type of solution we are talking about. But I'm really looking forward to seeing, you know, more reactions and inputs from the community, HundrED community as well, into this this particular thing, the solution, and how what are their potential to make a difference around the world.
And as mentioned, what is our goal is that based on this list and getting your feedback, challenging some of them, replacing some of them, to create a simple, in theory, simple toolkit of how to lead education ecosystem, either on a country, city, school, or class level, into following crises. What have we learned, and so on. So Pasi, would you say that in general you are optimistic regarding the education ecosystem, that we will learn and we are a lot better prepared next time? Or do you think that after 6 months, 12 months, we tend to forget all the key learnings?
Yes and no. I believe in this kind of a creative power that we have as a community, you and all of us. So we have a potential to come about with a new novel thinking. But on the other side, I think what most of us, probably all of us, what we're gonna see within the next 5 years is a very difficult financial conditions that are putting particularly public education systems, but also all education systems, including higher education, in a really difficult situation. And I think the real questions within the next 5 years are not that what works and what are the good ideas. I think there will be a lot of thinking and conversations about how can we do more with the less resources, unfortunately. But that's exactly where the creativity is the power to do things. So my advice would be for everybody not to go to the future with the kind of a list of new things that we will do with the growing budgets and more resources. That's not going to happen in most places. I think we need to be really smart and creative to be able to go around those issues that will hit really hard in most education systems around the world.
But maybe there's a silver lining on this one, because when we've been analyzing in many countries what are the things that have been working, it's actually the simple things, which means that going back to the basics and so on. So maybe this is also sort of like leading us back to the basics of a great education. Or how do you say yourself?
Absolutely brilliant, Saku, as always.
Excellent. So thank you so much. And like mentioned, hopefully we will see many of you on next Monday, and also help us to co-create this kind of document together. That would be brilliant. So thanks for spending the either afternoon or evening or morning, whatever it is for you, together with us. And hopefully we'll see you next Monday again. Thank you so much.